Welcome back. We will start with lecture 5 now. We are in the module 10. We are discussing communication, development of communicative capabilities, conversational skills among children. So far we have looked at various perspectives like implicature and their understanding of implicature, how much children follow the maxims of Grice in various domains, and we have also seen variables like turn taking, timing and so on. Now, we will move on to the last couple of variables that we will be able to discuss within this course. So, the variables are politeness and figurative language comprehension. Now, politeness, as we all know, is an important aspect of conversation. In any conversation, we need various degrees of politeness depending on the socio-cultural factors as well. So, this is an important aspect of conversation. No matter which culture you are in, there is an amount of politeness that is expected in any kind of conversation. So, in order to use this particular feature appropriately, children need to master more than just the linguistic factors. Because politeness, as it is perceived in a community, as it is perceived in a culture, is different from one place to another, one language to another. That is one, and secondly, how to signal the politeness, that also differs. So, as a result, this takes us to two important variables within politeness strategy itself. One is the linguistic form for marking the degrees of politeness. So, we need to know, the child needs to know, we are talking about children taking part in conversation. So, children need to know the linguistic forms that are important for signaling this different stages of politeness, different degrees of politeness. Now, this can be different from one culture to another culture. Some cultures might have very complicated and very layered sort of linguistic forms. Based on their understanding of politeness, some cultures might have less. So, the child needs to know. Secondly, the pragmatic condition on greetings, requests, etc., also need to be understood by the child. So, how can those things differ? There are multiple factors like status, age, the gender, sex of the person in a conversation, and so on and so forth. Many cultures have actually pretty elaborate system of address terms, or how you can and how you cannot use certain terms in a conversation and so on. So, these two things need to be mastered by children in order for them to signal politeness properly. So, as I just said, this differs from culture to culture. Let us just see how. So, in Chinese, Japanese, basically many of the eastern languages, the child must learn to use the appropriate address terms for relatives for each occasion, as well as any honorifics required. What is honorific? Honorifics are those grammatical aspects in language which signals the relative relationship between the speaker and the hearer. So, the same person addressing a person who is younger may address one term, but addressing somebody older can use another term for the same thing. So, in Indian languages, for example, you have a three-way use of pronouns. You have tu, tum and ap. Now, ap is for somebody who is older. It can be also for somebody who is in a higher status. It can also be for various other factors. Now, in certain cases, and tu and tum is for friends and people who are closer to you. Tu is typically reserved for people who are younger, or sometimes much lower in status with respect to the speaker. Now, this is not always in such a linear form. Sometimes there is a very complex interrelationship between these factors, between age, relationship, status and many other things. So, this is a complicated pattern. So, we have to know the child in these situations, in this kind of cultures, they need to not only learn the address terms, but also know exactly what to use where. But in other cases, in other countries, in some western countries, for example, we have data from Norwegian and Hungarian. So, in Norwegian, one must learn to use hints in comments or remarks rather than the more elaborate request. So, in Hungarian, the practice is to use more elaborate requests, but in Norwegian, the practice is to use hints. and in Indian and other Asian languages there is an elaborate system itself, there is a whole lexicon that needs to be understood and utilized properly. So, what do the findings say? The spontaneous requests in the speech of Italian children have been studied. There is a very interesting study on this. So, what they found with Italian children is that there are apparently few stages through which children actually master this. So, up until the age 4, children rely mainly on direct questions. When they are very young, when they are by age 4 till age 4, they use direct questions and questions and imperatives. As they get older, they use expressions like please, then use ask for give reasons, add softeners of various kinds, and then start to state their wishes in generic form. So, there are these particular types of changes that the researchers have found with respect to Italian children. Initially, they ask directly. As they get older, they start to use a more varied repertoire of various kinds. So, they can use request words like please, they sometimes give their own reasons, that is they explain, they also can add softeners and so on and so forth. By age 6, they can produce a range of syntactic forms, but do not yet modulate their requests appropriately. By age 7 or so, they can vary both form and content in making politeness requests. So, you can see there is a trajectory that starts at by 4 and then gradually they build up on their understanding, and as their language repertoire gets better, they use more and more complicated structures to signal politeness. That is basically the finding here. So, this is also consistent with the children's judgment of politeness, because to understand what is politeness also takes them some time, right. This is sometimes even taught in certain cultures, sometimes it is understood from the setting and so on. So, as their understanding goes and their language repertoire also grows simultaneously, and they are able to create more and more complex patterns for achieving that politeness. So, some more pointers in this research is that children are politer when they produce positive requests. So, there is a difference between when they are using positive request versus negative request. They are generally found to be more polite when using positive request, like asking someone to do something. You request, can you get me this, and like that. You want something. So, positive request. Negative request is when you are asking somebody to not do something. So, do not take my toy away or something like that. In that case, they are found to be less polite. So, more polite in positive request and less polite in negative request. So, these are the two types. Also, their politeness has a pattern. Pattern is like, so they are depending on the who the addressee is, their politeness actually has degrees. So, when the addressee is older, they are more polite, they are less polite to their peers and even less polite to the to younger children. So, this is how the pattern goes. So, there is a it is not like one size fits all, they do figure out politeness as a construct, and they actually use it in a very productive way as well, depending on all these factors. Now, how do you actually measure this? This particular study that I am referring to, they used the number of times the word please was used. So, they found it that it occurs 84% of requests for in case of adults, but only 37% of requests were to 2-year-olds. So, that is the difference between the older addressee as well and as opposed to younger addressee. So, thus far we have figured out that children do acquire the conversation tricks, takes them a little bit of time as they find their way through the social norms, the linguistic norms, their linguistic repertoire, as well as their understanding of certain complex social norms as to what is politeness and how do you what is the relative position of the older addressee versus a younger addressee and so on. So, some of the conversation rules are culture specific, and hence we see different patterns. That is one domain. The last domain that we will be discussing is called the figurative language acquisition. Now, figurative language is something that is pretty common in conversation. Figurative language refers to using non-literal language. Non-literal as in whatever you are saying, it does not have the exact literal meaning. So, I might use the same sentence can be used in an assertive way, also as a sarcastic, in a sarcastic way, it can be an irony, it can be a metaphor, various ways. So, what happens in figurative language is that the speaker's intentions go beyond the semantics of the utterance. Speaker's intention as in what I want to convey. When I am speaking, if I want to convey something, I can use the same sentence, same simple sentence, but I can use it to convey a different intent beyond, above and beyond the stated meaning. That is what is figurative language. Now, this is intertwined with a number of things like contextual information, conceptual, world knowledge and so on and so forth. Just to give you an example of a figurative language use, we often say that I am at a crossroads. Being at a crossroads is a very common way of talking about a life stage. So, I am at a position where I have to I have many options, now I have to decide where to go. Now, what is happening here is we are trying to talk about life in terms of a journey. So, when are you in the crossroads? When you are on the roads? So, you are on a road and you have now arrived at a position that you are calling crossroads. So, life is understood in terms of a physical journey, road journey, let us say. So, this is an example of metaphor. What is metaphor? Metaphor is a scenario where you are trying to use a concrete domain to understand an abstract domain. So, we in order to talk about an abstract domain, you use the parameters or let us say certain aspects of a concrete domain to make your case easy or tangible. So, when I say I am at a crossroads, you immediately understand, because everybody has had some experience of journey, smaller or bigger, complex or simple, but journey as an experience is an embodied experience, everybody understands that. So, when you talk about life in terms of that, it is understandable. So, that is how figurative language works. So, and similarly irony is another where I want to, my intention is more important than the actual meaning of the sentence. So, metaphor is one such figurative language use which is often used in conversational setup. Now, the what has been studied is whether children are able to produce and comprehend metaphor in sentences or not in a conversation setup. That is what we are interested in. So, as I just said that what is a metaphor? Metaphor is a common type of figurative language where one idea is understood through another. Often the abstract idea is understood through the concrete one. So, you need an embodied experience, a concrete tangible experience in order to talk about. For example, time is understood often in terms of space. So, the meeting has been shifted 2 days ahead, like this. So, ahead and behind are spatial terms. Similarly, you can also have something like this, she is a warm person. So, somebody you can say he is a very cold person. So, here what we are trying to say is that the nature of the person we are trying to understand through the domain of temperature. So, cold is somebody who is not very accessible, who is not very emotionally available, something like that. But on the other hand, warmth is something that you attach with being connected, somebody who is nice and so on and so forth. So, basically some characteristic features with something tangible, that is metaphor. So, this is also another kind of implicature, by the way, and as per Grice, metaphors arise out of a violation of the maxim of quality, because we are violating certain things here. We are violating the maxim of quality. So, children in their preschool ages, often there are many studies which have looked into it, and they found out that children before they go to school, they often actually seem to use some metaphorical language. metaphorical seem to use because there is a debate as to whether this kind of utterances can be actually considered to be real metaphors or they are just some kind of an extension. For example, many studies have looked into it. So, they talk about calling a toy car snake, while twisting it up his mother's arms. A child is referring to the toy as a snake, because he is playing with his mother with his toy in his hand, and he is trying to twist it over her mother's arm, his mother's arm, and they calling it a snake. Now, does it qualify to be a metaphorical language? There are debates, but children do use such kind of constructs in their conversation. Also, sometimes they will use anything, a cardboard or anything into their ear and pretend that this is a phone, and they will talk on the phone, also call it a phone. So, basically they are comparing things, they are comparing one thing to another, that is what metaphor is all about. So, as a result of which some scholars have called it metaphorical use, but some others do not agree. However, this kind of use of language is quite common among preschool children. Now, initial finding with respect to whether this understanding whether this kind of use of language also translates into children actually understanding real metaphors or not, that has been also carried out. So, the older studies go back all the way to 1976. This was a very well known study. So, early developmental studies found that children's metaphor comprehension is actually a late achievement. They do not understand metaphors when irrespective of whether they use their own kinds of metaphors, when the real metaphors are tested on them, they do not seem to do very well. So, this particular study, Winner et al. 1976, they looked at two types of metaphor. One they called psychological physical metaphor, and the other they called cross sensory metaphor. So, these examples I have taken from this work. For example, psychological physical metaphor was the one sentence, the prison guard was a hard rock, meaning it was not very easy to he was a very tough person, he was a very tough guard. So, here the psychological aspect was compared with the physical property of a rock. So, as hard as a rock kind of thing. So, that was one. The cross sensory metaphor, for example, they use sentences like her perfume was bright sunshine. So, here there you have two different sensory domains that are mapped onto one another. So, perfume basically this has to do with the sense of smell, but they are using the bright sunshine, which is a visual term. So, there are this mapping of cross sensory. So, this kind of examples they had used, and the task was children had to tell what the sentence meant, and in some cases they had to choose between 4 options. So, this was the task. So, they were given this kind of sentences, and they had to sometimes they had to answer what it meant, and sometimes they had to choose between options given. So, what did the result show? Children below 10 years could not understand the metaphorical meaning. This is quite a late stage, by 10 years they understand language pretty well. So, what happened was they gave literal interpretation involving magic. So, when they were asked what does the sentence mean, they gave a literal interpretation, sometimes using concept of magic. For example, the king had a magic rock and he turned the guard into another rock. That is how they explained the sentence. Sometimes they also changed the sentence altogether. The guard worked in a prison that had hard rock walls. So, basically they interpreted in many ways, but except in metaphorical ways. 8-year-olds used what they call a primitive metaphoric interpretation. The guard had hard tough muscles, because that is what they interpreted, the rock symbolizing. And even 10-year-olds could not interpret the metaphor accurately. So, this was the finding. Now, based on such this and many other such findings, that children are till very late do not actually interpret metaphors properly. They are not able to explain them, they are not able to interpret them metaphorically, because of these factors there have been many theories as to when and how children actually acquire the metaphorical understanding. So, the one theory is called the literal stage theory and the other is the early onset hypothesis. So, the literal stage hypothesis basically takes care of the finding that children are not able to interpret sentences metaphorically. So, the literal hypothesis is based on the observation that children tend to use apparent metaphor during the preschool age, but stops using them later, because we have already seen that whatever it can be considered a real metaphor, it may not be considered a real metaphor, but they do seem to use some non-literal language. However, as the experiments show that when they go to school, by the time they go to school, they do not understand them properly, they are not able to interpret them properly. So, notably during their elementary school years, they have difficulty comprehending metaphor. Hence, the proposal is that children have a literal phase in their figurative language acquisition development. They call it a literal phase, meaning that they start with some amount of understanding, but then they go to a stage where they interpret everything literally, and then when they are older, they again understand language metaphors properly. So, there is a stage called literal stage, and hence the name. So, after a creative phase, children enter a literal phase characterized by tendency towards literal interpretation and decrease in use of figurative language. Eventually, in early adolescence, a more sophisticated level of figurative language skill is attained. So, it takes lot of time around early adolescence. Until then, children use, and I quote, a piece by piece elaboration of the linguistic input. Children process language literally even when it does not make sense in the linguistic context. So, that is how they have talked about in this theory. However, later studies actually pointed out that children's poor performance may not be because of their lack of understanding, but due to many other factors. One of the factors that have been pointed out by a number of researchers is the task related problem. The task was probably designed in such a way in the older studies that made it difficult for the child to interpret the metaphor. So, if we change the task condition, we might find something else. So, the reasons as a result, they provided the 2 or 3 main reasons. One was children do not necessarily have the conceptual difficulties, because the interpretation of the previous result was that children do not understand that difficulty. They do not have the conceptual ability to parse the literal and the metaphorical meaning. So, the counter to that is children actually do have the abilities. So, there are many studies in this regard. So, in one of them 3-year-olds could distinguish meaningful comparisons like literal or metaphorical, like rain is like snow or tears, from a nonsensical comparison. There have been many kinds of studies trying to figure out whether children actually understand the differences, or let us say layers of differences in meaning or not. Hence, they created this kind of possibilities where rain is like a dog, rain is like snow, rain is like tears, and they tried to see whether children can actually understand the differences in these meanings, and they found that they could, children actually could. 3 years. After 4 years, children understood the difference between literal and metaphorical comparisons. Now, these findings have pointed out that children do have the basic prerequisites in place by the time they are 3 years of age, which is pretty early, and it goes entirely opposite the findings of the previous studies. Secondly, comprehension of metaphor depends on familiarity of a conceptual domain. One of the serious criticisms against the initial findings was that the metaphors were used abruptly, without familiarizing the children with the conceptual domain. If they do not have, because small children may not have familiarity with multiple conceptual domains that the adults have. So, we have to keep that in mind. So, the idea is that because understanding or deciphering metaphor is rely on the understanding of that entire domain. So, it is possible that the world knowledge required were missing in the previous experiments, right. That is the counter. Also, it was found that once children comprehend a metaphor within a certain conceptual domain, they can interpret other metaphors in the same domain. This is the second counter. Thirdly, researchers have pointed out that studies included a heavy meta-linguistic load and metaphors were presented out of context. So, there were not much of a contextual information within which the child could interpret the metaphor. So, they needed to understand a lot of meta-linguistic aspects of those utterances, which probably was adding to the cognitive load. So, as to counter that, the other later studies have looked at various kinds of methods like act out method, simple questions and embedded metaphors in stories. Later studies have used a lot of studies have used stories. So, the children will be told a story and at the end of it they were given a metaphorical sentence to either interpret or to understand or whatever, the different kinds of tasks are there. So, using a different method by reducing the cognitive load, that means that not giving the context and not meaning giving the metaphor out of context, they actually have found much better result. So, many studies have found that children actually do pretty well. One of them, for example, they use stories, then then at the end they asked the children some things about the main character. For example, what the main character felt. And so, after a whole story that they were something was happening to one character and at the end of it, what do you think the character is feeling? What does the, let us say, the rabbit feels? So, and then they gave options between bouncing bubble and sinking boat. Does the rabbit feel like a bouncing bubble or does the rabbit feel like a sinking boat? So, both of these figurative expressions had opposite mental states and the children were given this kind of options and they even 5-year-olds could do well in this task. However, only older children could explain what is happening, but younger children could get it right. They could not provide a proper explanation, but they got it. Thus, children did better in a forced choice experiment. This is called a forced choice because you have only two options, either of them is correct, one of them is correct. So, this is forced, it is not an open ended conversation. So, what do you think the rabbit felt, rather than asking them that, rather than that you give a forced choice and children typically did better in a forced choice experiment. Similar, many other studies have been also carried out using stories. So, they also found similar kind of results. So, wherever stories have been used, children have been found to do much better. For example, in one such story, they asked children to help a puppet answer various kinds of questions. So, even 5-year-old could explain their answers in this case, because the more elaborate the story is, the better the contextual information is, the better the child's performance in this task. So, we see that even 5-year-old could do well in they could get the metaphor, they could even explain this. Hence, there was another theory that was proposed, which is called the early onset hypothesis. This basically means that children are able to understand metaphors much earlier than considered before. So, as a result, an early onset of metaphor competence. This ability emerges in early preschool years and develops throughout childhood. Children can be both literal and non-literal at the same time. They can be in both stages at the same time. So, this theory, the early onset theory, actually takes into account both the cases where some children are not able to get the metaphorical meaning, whereas others are able to. They try to explain it as the existence of both stages as a possibility, because these might depend on various other factors like conceptual knowledge, the world knowledge, how you have used the tasks in a given experimental setup and so on and so forth. So, based on that, results can differ. However, children do understand, children do have metaphorical conceptualization much earlier in life. So, to summarize, it is now understood that children might be able to understand a metaphor if presented with a forced choice. So, what are the conditions under which children might do better in metaphor related tasks is that they might be given a forced choice task, where the context is made predictable and the metaphorical domains correspond to the child's world knowledge. So, in these cases the child will be able to do. So, basically giving a very conducive condition. If you give a conducive condition, then the child will be able to comprehend metaphor much better. If not, they may not. So, there are a couple of more domains within figurative language usage. For example, there is metonymy, there is also irony, but the data from these domains are much less as opposed to metaphor related studies, but there have been few. So, let me just refer to a couple of studies. In a semi-structured elicitation task for children aged 3 to 5-year-old, it was found that metonymies were prevalent in the production of all age groups. So, children could use metonymy. Metonymy as opposed to metaphor is a so, in metaphor what happens, you use one domain to understand another entire domain. So, one domain could be concrete, the other is abstract. In metonymy, one particular object is called the vehicle. For example, a famous example is the ham sandwich spilled beer all over himself. It is a famous example from the textbooks. So, what we mean by that is the person eating the ham sandwich spilled beer, but rather than saying the person, we use ham sandwich to mean that the person. So, vehicle and target. So, children are also found to be using such constructions when they are very young. So, children were first shown a context picture in this particular task. They were given a picture and told a story, again a story based elicitation task about the two characters in the picture, one of whom had a salient property like a large nose, bicycle helmet and so on and so forth. First there was the story given where there were two characters and one of them had a salient feature. Typically in children's stories we have something that stands out, salient as in important. So, one character might have a large nose, another character might be having a bicycle helmet and so on. In the target sentence, the salient property of this character was used as a subject. For example, as I just said the ham sandwich like that. So, they can use a helmet as the main character. So, because one of the characters had a bicycle helmet which was a prominent feature in the target sentence, they use that particular feature and create a sentence like the helmet rides home. They do not mean the helmet went on its own, they mean the person wearing the helmet went home. And what was the task? Children had to select matching picture from a set of 3 smaller pictures. So, one was close up of each individual in the story, and so each individual as in the metonymic referent and the other character. So, when they said that the helmet went home, what do they mean? So, children had to pick from 3 pictures. One of the picture was the person wearing the helmet, the other was the other person, and the third was the salient property by itself. So, if you are talking about the salient property by itself and if the child picks up this third referent, it will mean that they have taken it literally. But if they are able to point out the person who was wearing the helmet, then they have gotten the metonymic meaning of the sentence. And after they have chosen, they also had to explain the choice. That was the task. By age 3, children were found to understand metonymy in context, which is quite interesting, because the age 3 we have seen many studies were found showed that they do not get metaphor at that stage. But based within a story based elicitation task, they actually tend to do well in this case as well. Some studies also have found an interesting pattern that older children tend to pick up a literal explanation in a metonymic condition, but younger children do better, they actually pick up the metonymic aspect of the sentence. They have tried to explain it through development of other communication relevant abilities affecting the figurative language understanding. So, because their still developing other communicative abilities, probably that has an impact. Some eye tracking studies have also been done on this, and they show a similar pattern that older children tend to take the literal meaning rather than the metonymic meaning, but we need more data in order to know for sure. Some studies have been carried out, and this is what they say. The last pointer in this, we are talking about irony. Irony in this domain also data is not very rich. However, some available information suggests that children have a later development of the comprehension and production of irony as well. This emerges around age 6, and before this age children tend to interpret even the ironical utterances as a literal utterance. So, they do not get the irony. This delay is often understood or attributed to the speaker's intention and distance from the literal interpretation. So, for the child to understand that the speaker is distancing himself from the literal interpretation, and all of that takes a little bit of time. So, children, younger children before 6 years of age, they do not do very well in interpreting irony. So, to sum up, conversation skill is a domain that seem to develop in children through stages, and depending on what kind of aspect we are talking about, the stage might be different. So, some aspects might develop earlier as opposed to some others. However, the pattern seems to be that they do take some time to completely master all the aspects of conversational skill. Older children typically tend to do better in terms of a number of parameters, and some of these conversational practices are dependent on social variables like cultural practices and the environment the child is living, and so on, because metalinguistic abilities often has to do with the exposure and the world knowledge of the child. So, those are also important variables, as a result of which we might have differences not only in terms of the within domain parameters, but also in terms of social and cultural differences, and so on. So, this is where we will end this module. Thank you.